In full transparency, this podcast series was originally entitled America After Trump, America's Second Reconstruction. I recorded the first 3 episodes the week before the election. Even though the polling had the presidential race tied, I never thought this country would put Trump back into office, especially after January 6th and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Well, I have never been more wrong. So with the election of Donald J. Trump on November 5th, 2024, I changed the title of this podcast to Trump's America, because whether you like it or not, we are living in Trump's America. I didn't want to throw the first 3 episodes in the trash. I thought they were really great conversations that I want to share with you. So forgive me on a couple of questions that are not relevant anymore. But I hope you enjoy the 95% of this episode that is extremely relevant in our current reality. Thank you. Welcome to America After Trump, America's Second Reconstruction. I'm your host, Mick Larson. Today's podcast guest is Dan Barker. He's an author, activist, and co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Dan is a true Renaissance man. He's authored several books. He's an accomplished musician and songwriter. All right, let's do this. Well, Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
You have quite a story background from being a teenage preacher to now being the co-president of the Freedom of Religion. Tell the listeners a little bit about your story.
Freedom from religion.
Yeah. Freedom from religion. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was a teenage preacher evangelist. I carried my Bible to school, and I went on missionary trips down to Mexico and traveled as an evangelist, young teenage evangelist. And I got ordained to the ministry, and then I was a co-pastor in 3 different California churches, and I was a Christian songwriter. And then I traveled the country for about 8 years, just preaching and doing music. And I wrote some musicals that became pretty well known among men of music. It was a bestseller for a while. And actually today I'm still getting royalties from some of that music, which is weird. But that lasted, I preached for about 19 years, and then I saw the light. It wasn't that quick. It took 4 or 5 years of reading and thinking and changing and going, oh my goodness, what was I believing? What was I thinking? And the way I like to try to explain it is that I kind of became my own science experiment. It was almost like, here I am, I'm driving my car down the freeways of Los Angeles, and I'm talking to God here, but then another part of me is going, hey, who are you talking to? What is that really? And it's like another voice was examining myself, and I would even say to God, you know what, I don't know if you're real or not, but I'm still talking to you. So it was all of that. It took a while to go through that whole process until finally I learned painfully that what I was preaching is just not true. There is a little bit of truth in the Bible, and most Christians are good people and they're doing good things, but the actual basic teachings and the reliability of the Bible, there's not even a coherent definition of a God. What is it? Everyone thinks they know what it is. There's no good evidence for the God. If there were, we would see it, but there's not. There's no good argument for a God, and there's been a number of them: design argument and first cause argument and the moral argument and so on. There's no agreement among the believers about the nature of this God, and they all fight with each other, and they all have their differences. Even though the Bible says, Paul told believers, you should all be of one mind, let there be no disagreement among you. And yet, look what happens. And then, of course, the problem of evil, or these days they call it the problem of suffering. Most philosophers do. And then I realized, you know what, there's no need for this God. We can all live good, happy, moral, productive, loving lives without this extra stuff. And I realized, well, you should judge people not by what they believe, but what they do, by their actions. And so in 1983, that summer, in a little church down south of the border, south of Mexicali, Mexico, I realized, you know what, I don't think there is a God. I think, what does that mean? Is atheist? Is that the right word? So I was like a brand new thinker. I thought I was the only one. And a lot of us feel that way. We think we're the only ones who's gone through it, which is kind of cool because it means it was bottom up. It was
Right.
me thinking rather than somebody
telling you.
telling me. Yeah, you know what I mean? Like somebody convinced me. It wasn't that at all. In fact, I didn't like the word atheist. I thought, I used to preach. The fool said in his heart, "There's no God, and they're all corrupt, and they don't have any moral values." But my mind had to go where it went, and a few months later, I sent a letter out to everybody saying, "That's it," and that was January of '84.
Did you always call yourself an atheist, or did you go through like a agnostic, any process?
Yeah, for a couple of months.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, even today, I'll say I'm both.
Yeah.
Because the words are addressing two separate concepts. One is addressing belief, the other is addressing knowledge. And so you can be both, and I think most atheists would say they are also agnostics, but there are some agnostics who will say they are theists, kind of like Blaise Pascal, the philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
He said, we can't know if there's a God. He was agnostic, but he said, you're better off believing. Even if you don't know.
As a default.
Well, yeah, you sometimes call Pascal's wager, which I'm oversimplifying it, but and in the beginning I was still fleshing all that out. It was like new territory. And in the letter I sent to everybody, I even said that. I think I'm agnostic or atheist, but, and I reproduced that letter in my book Godless and Losing Faith in Faith. And it's just a one-page letter to all my friends and relatives and co-workers and people in the music industry, Christian music industry, and co-missionaries, telling them I'm not going to preach anymore. Well, you can invite me to preach, but it'll be a totally different sermon,
Right.
But anyway, that's a long. And then that same year, '84, a few months later, I met Annie Gaylor and Annie Laurie Gaylor. And Annie Laurie and I met on Oprah Winfrey's show. I think I told you that story before.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And we are now married. We've been married, 37 years now? So we have a video of the day we met. That's kind of cool.
That's really cool. Meeting on Oprah.
Yeah, well, it wasn't her national show. She had a show in Chicago.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Called AM Chicago.
So that was before she had the national show.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but she was getting real popular, and that's what launched her to be a national. So we were on her AM Chicago show that, like September of '84.
So how did you follow up with Annie Laurie after you met her on Oprah's show?
Well, it was later. I was married. I had a Christian marriage, and my Christian wife and I, we thought about it and tried it, but it wouldn't work. She always wanted to be a pastor's wife. And when I changed, I have to give her some credit. She tried to bend, because I was really into feminism too.
Right.
You shouldn't be my subordinate. You shouldn't be like I'm the head of. We should be equals here, And she couldn't see that, and we divorced. It was painful, but then she later remarried a Baptist minister.
She was on the hunt. She was definitely going to be a pastor's wife. That's
and I don't think he stayed a pastor that long. But anyway, they're still together, and I'm glad they're happy, and I'm glad they're together, and I'm glad it worked out.
Yeah.
That she found a life that fit her, and I never wanted to force her to be like, you're my wife, you have to think like I do, kind of thing.
Right.
Which,
of course
and
not.
we realized, for the first 10, 12, 13 years, we had a good marriage because we were on the same page. We were ministering together. We had 4 children together, and then, of course, when I changed, it was just too much. She could only bend so far without breaking, she said. She couldn't.
Yeah.
She couldn't.
It's tough to be in a committed relationship with 2 different worldviews.
It can happen. I know people where it happens, but yeah, it's tough. We have members of our group who are atheists whose spouse is a devout believer, and they love each other, they have a family, and they get along, and they respect each other. So it can happen, but I think it's pretty rare.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, I'm sure.
Yeah.
The podcast is called America After Trump, America's Second Reconstruction. What do you think about that idea that it could be a second Reconstruction for the country? And I say that because we have so much work to do.
So I guess I'm not familiar with the concept. You're talking about
after the Civil War. Yep.
So what are you envisioning that future would be? What is that after like, are you thinking?
Well, I just see some similarities between what happened during the Civil War and what happened during Trump's presidency.
Yeah.
With the attack on the Capitol, the insurrection, and the Confederate States trying to attack the U.S. Capitol. All the changes that kind of needed to happen socially in the South. We have different problems like misinformation, disinformation, white Christian nationalism, this kind of bent towards authoritarianism that Trump has brought. So that's what I mean by Reconstruction, that we've got a lot of work to do.
I see.
To try to bring the country back together. I mean, as partisan as everybody is, we need to get back to being Americans and not Democrats and Republicans per se. America that works for all Americans.
Well, that's a nice concept on paper, but people
Sure.
are,
But I'm just curious. I'm asking guests, like, what do you think about that concept?
Well, assuming that democracy survives, and let's assume that it does, and assuming that we get a better Supreme Court in the future that really respects the Constitution as many of us believe it should be respected and not trampled on, especially in our organization regarding separation of state and church and religion, then we have...
I would say that's part of the Reconstruction, of trying to explain to people that this is a secular society. Our Constitution, there is no religion.
So I would view it more like a restoration to the basic principles that had been trampled on, and depending on how the votes go, depending on what the majority of people feel, I think, I'm an optimist, I think we could rebuild what we once used to have. We could make America good again. We can make America rational again. And who cares if America's great? It's almost a kind of a egotistical, our country has to be the greatest,
And we're obviously not, if you look at the whole world,
But even if we were, what a put down to the world,
Yeah.
Like I was just in Nigeria and seeing, and I think a lot of Nigerians pay more attention to American news than many Americans do. They care because they know the impact. But the idea that the city on a hill, the idea that this country was God's country in America, of course America is great in so many ways. The resources, that were stolen from my ancestors, basically. And so there's a lot of, if you have resources and you have money, then it's easy to be great. Look what happened to the British Empire after decolonization. And look at now, Britain is a country. It's a proud country, but it's not the great...
It's not a world power.
Yeah, like it used to be. So in my mind, it wouldn't matter if America dropped in the world standing. You know what I mean? Of course, if we respect American values of democracy and fairness and all of that, inclusivity, e pluribus unum, then of course America can still be a leader in some ways, but why do we have to be great? Why can't we just be humans on the same planet,
Yes.
And that's what I'm thinking. And so maybe a big blow to our honor, a big blow to our ego might be a good thing for our country, but I don't know. I'm not a prophet. I used to be a prophet. I could tell you the future if you wanted.
Well, it's, what I think the smart people say when Trump or the Republican Party says, make America great again, they say, well, great for who?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great for a certain privileged class of people, or caste, as...
Mainly like white men and, yeah.
As Isabel Wilkerson says it in her book, Caste, there's a pecking order, and it can be anything. Racism, it can be it, or it can also be religion, or it can be, origin, or whatever. And she talks about how even in these really desperately poor white communities in the South, these white people, at least I'm not black, at least there's somebody lower than me, right?
That's right.
And so we have, our human species, I think, kind of has this hierarchical thing built into
evolutionary, it's in us, the in-group and the out-group, and being afraid of the out-group. And
for tribalism.
Yeah. It's an evolutionary mismatch that we have, this fear of the other, where in 2024, we really don't need to be fearful of others, because we have so much information. We know who, let's say Vladimir Putin, that's not something to be concerned about. But,
So I don't know. I'm kind of hopeful because, it looks like this Gen Z, these younger people are stepping up to the plate. It looks like they are, especially the women in Gen Z, especially the young women who see what's so much is at stake. And 20, 30 years from now, when they are in power, what kind of a country will this be? Maybe there's cause for optimism. We never know what's going to happen, but I think this generation is smart, and they care, and they're motivated, and they're starting groups, they're starting activism,
They're very
doing
engaged.
protest, and they're voting more than like the young people of our generation. You probably voted, I voted, but it was really a low turnout.
You can't depend on the youth vote.
No, but maybe the youth vote, because Gen Z is not going to stay they're not going to stay that age. They're growing. So post-Trump, are you saying after he dies or after the election?
After he, no longer a political figure per se.
Yeah.
Or at least not running for president.
Yeah. So I guess we have work to do. And America has always been a country of questions and struggles and compromises and arguments, and from the very beginning, which was good.
Yeah.
It's a country of arguing, right? We don't want some king just to stomp in and go, here's your answer. From the very beginning, even in the Continental Congress and then in the conventional Constitutional Convention, arguing, disagreeing, winners and losers and votes and democracy, really messy, but it worked. And I was just reading Hannah Arendt's book on revolution, and she was asking, why is it that the American Revolution succeeded and the French didn't, And she said part of the reason is that we had a tradition before that convention of the local colonies having their town meetings in town hall where they got together to argue and fight it out and disagree, and they respected that. And so when our country was formed, they all came with that history and habit of getting together to work on compromises, right? Whereas in France, the poor revolted and they kicked out the king, and then there was nothing there to sustain or there was no habit there. And look quickly what happened in France. So revolutions, and I was just talking to some people in Nigeria because they had their revolutions, and each time, a lot of these African countries post-independence, each time the new person comes in, I'm for the people, and we're going to overthrow the regime, and then they just go into the same, the same habit. There's an old joke there that same taxi, different driver. They would just come in and, or early on in some of those countries, some of them were saying, we don't want these European colonists coming in here and raping and stealing from our country. We want to rape and steal from our country, and
effectively that's unfortunately what they get.
And so a revolution, revolutionaries are not necessarily good leaders. Washington was an exception to that rule, but and he was even more exceptional in that he didn't run again, which was amazing. He didn't want there to be a kingdom. He thought the people should just keep bubbling up and changing. So this experiment that's going to happen in the next decade or so, or whatever happens, is going to involve just a lot of sweat and arguing and compromising, and there's no single answer that's going to come from it. But how can we not be optimistic, at least, unless some horrible thing happens, some big natural disaster or something, where a strong man can come in and say, I'm going to solve this for you.
Well, and that's what you talked about in Nigeria is the reason why people do look up to America and other democratic countries is that the transfer of power.
Yeah.
That's a huge thing, and obviously the United States started that.
Yeah.
And so that's what kind of makes Trump's election fraud stuff so egregious, is because it really is trampling on the norms and the tradition of American government and American leaders.
Which is really disrespectful of American principles, because that peaceful transfer of power, nobody wants to do that. Everyone's reluctant. Al Gore was reluctant to, but he did it. And Hillary Clinton, but they do it. They understand this is America, and The will of the
They're
people.
putting the country before themselves and their ego,
Yeah.
basically, at that point.
Yeah. The will of the people isn't necessarily my will. It's the will of the people, if enough people vote. But I don't know. We went to vote absentee, and there was a really long line here. And we had to come back another day.
Oh,
So
is that right?
I think that's encouraging. People are, at least here, people care. They're involved, and they want to be a part of this democratic country.
If you were president of the United States, what would be some of your priorities?
I would demand a recount.
But you won, so I don't know.
But I wouldn't
By the
want
way, you bring up a really good point. It's like Trump is saying, I won, but everyone below the ticket, all the Republicans, he was the only one that lost. Like all the Republicans down ballot won.
Yeah.
That's the craziest thing. It's like,
No.
Anyway, what
No, I have
would
no
be
such ambitions.
priorities? But what would be, if you were president, what would be some priorities that you would like to see in the country?
I would admit my limitations. I mean, if I were president, it would be because I was the kind of person who had those ambitions and that knowledge, which I don't really.
Yeah.
I mean, but I would surround myself with people who do know, with experts in science. I would find out the best political scientists, climate scientists, people with the expertise, and carefully vet them. We saw Trump bragging to Harris, you guys never fired anybody. I fired a lot of people. Like that was a badge of honor. And really, if I were in her shoes, I would have said, well, if you had done a careful job of hiring in the first place, like we did, you wouldn't have to fire so many people, right? So for me, it would be like, I'm not going to be the guy who solves everything. What do I know? What does any president know? They have connections in some history, but it would be to really, really enlist the help of really smart people with experience and people that we know have strong values to what they do, not just loyal to me, like you have to do what I say, But of course, respecting state-church separation and appointing justices who respect that. And since I'm a liberal type, I would look for those. And I think liberal is what America should be and is, because what's wrong with liberal? Liberal is giving, caring, sharing, being human
Trying
beings.
to make America work for all Americans.
Well, yeah, exactly. So I would look for nominees to along those lines, of course. And look what Trump did. Trump didn't really do it. The Federalist Society did it.
Yes.
I don't think he even knew anything about judges.
Well, he didn't
at
know
all.
any of those judges.
He didn't know any of that stuff. But he said, "Help me out here," and they helped him out with their hand-picked choices. Kavanaugh and Barrett, and look how they've turned out. But it used to be. I read that it used to be that being on the Supreme Court had a liberalizing tendency over the years. People who started off conservative, as they grappled with the issues with real people, got more liberal. But that seems to have not been happening in the last decade or so.
Well, it's gotten so bad that they can't even figure out what an automatic weapon is. When they overturned the part of the gun that would make an automatic, they said, well, that's not, it's like, no, that makes it an automatic weapon. That's, illegal. So it's like, even the simple things they're getting wrong.
Yeah, and some of those questions are hard questions. Many judges and justices sometimes just have to make a call because what do they know? They've got experts on both sides, and they've got. But at the Supreme Court is more constitutional law, and so that's an animal you can kind of get a hold of. You can look at the Constitution, read it. They have different interpretations of it, of course.
Well, what do you think about this nonsense of constructionists, that we're reading the Constitution as if we were back in 1776 or something?
Yeah, and some of them have that originalists.
Originalists, yeah. Strict constructionists.
And that comes down to language. What did the language mean at the time? Well, there was one example I remember reading about. There was a law that said if a gun is used in any way in a drug deal, then the sentencing is doubled, right?
Right.
And so this one guy did a drug deal, and he had a gun. It was unloaded, and he used the gun as payment.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The gun
Mhm.
was payment.
Sure.
It wasn't a gun.
It wasn't, yeah.
Here, I'll trade you this gun. Well, because according to the original text, a gun was involved, right? So
Mhm.
therefore, that double sentence applied according to the court. But how do you read? What does that mean when you read the actual words and how they interpreted? And the danger, of course, is there's a lot of issues that come up today that were not even remotely in the minds of our founders at that time. Their well-regulated militia was a couple of blunderbusses and
a musket.
So originalism is I think dangerous, and I would look for justices that are basing on the law, but also on principle, on humanistic principles. When it comes down to interpreting things, what principles are you going to use when you make your interpretation? But I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a legal scholar, so what would I have to say? I would hire people to help me with that. Not the Federalist Society, but
No.
I would find somebody to help with those decisions.
Would you? What would be some of your policy initiatives if you were president?
I haven't thought that. You can lay out your platform. You can lay all that stuff out. And I think I would be way too radical. I think myself.
I can't wait to hear it. Let's hear it.
Well, this is just me. So
Yeah,
Annie Laurie, my wife, she disagrees with me on this, okay? And I think she's probably right? I don't think there should be such a thing as borders.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't. I think borders are really a crime against humanity. And look in the United States itself. We have 50 sovereign governments with their own capital, their own laws, and you can drive across any border you want to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're not being stopped and all that. And so I think part of the problem with borders is that we put these borders up, and that makes them a big red flashing light, right?
Mm-hmm.
But others think that that's too idealistic. I mean, and probably is, to think that we shouldn't have borders in the world.
That they're not there. That would mean there's no real sovereign countries.
Yeah, but look at the 50 states, aren't they? Don't they all have their capitals? Aren't they sovereign? Don't
but
they make their laws?
Report to one federal government.
Yeah.
And those federal government laws do supersede state laws. So
yeah.
But
So
I agree with you in theory, but in practice.
In practice, no, because if we were, for example, to just get rid of all the borders, which in the long run I think would be beautiful, in the short run it would be horrible, because that would mean a massive redistribution of wealth. And what are the rich people going to do? What are they going to do when they realize that they're going to have to share with all these people that, the way Trump talks about them, they're not even humans, do you think?
Yeah.
But they are. They're people with families and love and desires and dreams, just like anybody's family. They're human beings.
Well,
and to demonize them and to think that they're these brown people that are not us, like somehow...
Well, they seem to forget we are a country of immigrants, and everyone that's here immigrated here unless you're Native American.
Yeah, sometimes people tell me as an atheist, why don't you go back where you came from? And I'm going... Why don't you? And I don't know the whole history, but I know that immigration law and immigration policy is not original. I think there never was immigration policy. Everybody was free to just come in.
Right, because there weren't, especially if you're exploring new territory.
Yeah, and we want them in. Come on in,
Yeah.
But see, I'm not an expert on that stuff either. I would have to. If I was going to take political office, which I would never want to do, I don't have that kind of drive. I would hate to go knocking on doors asking people for money, But some people do that, and they need to. But I would have to just study, and you can study all these theories and philosophies and policy differences. You can do all that stuff, which we should. But ultimately, doesn't it come down to what are your basic principles? Are your basic principles for humanistic concepts? Is that what it is? Those can guide you in all of your decisions. And
if you're looking the best way for human flourishing, then that can dictate what decisions you make.
Yeah, or in my moral philosophy, if you are doing the best you can to minimize as much harm as possible. Minimizing harm, I think, is the essence of morality. And so most issues come down to harm. I mean, even when you take a lawsuit, you have to show injury. There's a harm involved, right? So injury, harm is, if a person's not acting with the intention of minimizing harm, or if they're trying to maximize it, then we call those people immoral or evil or whatever word you want to use. But a humanist would say, let's try to have a world. You can't eliminate all harm, of course, but let's try our best to minimize it for everybody, which is the opposite of Bentham's utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. It's the least amount of harm for the greatest. That's a different kind of thing, and I don't know if any government in the world can really measure that. There's probably a lot of data out there, but how do you measure the greatest good for the greatest number? At least in our personal lives, we can act that way. At least we can act. You see somebody suffering, you want to stop that, right? You see
someone homeless, you want to provide home.
Inequality or whatever. You want to do something to try to make less harm, and then their happiness is up to them. Their flourishing is up to them. Where the government shouldn't be telling people how you're supposed to be happy, but
or dictating what happiness is, because it's going to be different for everybody.
Unless it's a Christian nationalist government, they will tell you exactly what you need to do and how to live. And
what worries you about this current environment where Christian white nationalism is on the rise and has found a political home in the Republican Party?
Well, that's the problem. Political is the word political. When I was a preacher, I would have promoted, and they're free to promote their values in this country, right?
Of course they are.
And they should build their churches and have their schools, and you know what I mean. This is the free country, right? But when it becomes political, meaning they want to impose it on everybody else, that's the problem,
right?
Because we don't all think the same, but they want us to all think the same, and some of them are so extreme about it, they don't trust democracy. In fact, many of them are using the machinery of democracy in order to destroy democracy, which some of them actually think under God's rule, he's a king, right? Kings aren't democratic.
Right.
They call him the Lord, the king, the master, the sovereign. And if that was the kind of government we lived under, we would not have democratic rule. We would not have equity among people.
Do you think that I think one of the good things that Trump has done is expose conservative Christians, especially those that have voted for him at a clip of 80%, has exposed evangelical Christians, conservative Christians, that they're more about power than they are about following the teachings of Jesus.
Yeah, and I would take issue with even the teachings of Jesus. I think if the world followed the teachings of Jesus, this would not be a very good world. But if you cherry pick a few little verses from the New Testament and focus on them, which most good Christians do.
Yeah, love your neighbor, welcome the stranger, take care of the sick and the poor.
That kind of stuff, which every religion says that.
Yeah.
I mean, some religion comes along and said, we're a religion of love. Well, they all say that. We're a religion of peace. Really? A religion of peace? I want to join that. But they all say that. So, I mean, it's like they can say they're a religion of love. And when Jesus used that phrase, love your neighbor as yourself, he was quoting an Old Testament passage that his jealous father had given. And that love your neighbor applied only to your Hebrew neighbor. Mm-hmm. And they even said, among your kin, among your group, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, every group does that, right? Mm-hmm. Every group loves itself. Yeah. But there was no love to neighboring tribes back then. And Jesus was quoting basically a kind of, imperialistic or exclusive doctrine when he said, love your neighbor. But most Christians today don't see it that way. And I think it's to their credit, the most Christians who are good Christians, that they are reading it in this positive sense, that everybody in the world is my neighbor, not just my own Hebrew kin. And so we need to give credit to that. My brother Tom is a great guy. He's an evangelical Christian, and he's part of the 18% of evangelicals who did not vote for Trump. So Tom and I, we have this sort of truce that we don't talk about religion because it's just not going to work, but we can talk about Trump. Because we both, I'm speaking as myself now. I'm not representing FFRF, right? Because we don't know everybody's political views in it. And but we can get together, and that's pretty cool that we have something like that. And there are evangelicals against Trump, and there are some of them, right?
Oh yeah, Vote Common Good is one of the organizations I know of that are out there promoting.
So, and then there's Amanda Tyler's group, Christians Against Christian Nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
They understand it. They're not only smart, but they're caring Christians, and they understand. And there's Greg Boyd. I debated him a couple of times. He's an evangelical pastor in Minnesota. He's the kind who says we need state-church separation because the gospel should be about voluntary love. And as soon as you link it to the state, you're linking it with force.
Yeah.
And he said a forceful conversion is not a true conversion. Christians should be on their own showing the love of Christ and attracting them because of that, because of the message, not because somebody in power is making that happen. Like Ryan Walters in Oklahoma, the superintendent of public instruction, who wants to put Bibles in every classroom. He thinks since he's elected as a Christian, he has the authority now to impose his Christianity on everybody else. And to me, that's kind of a betrayal of at least Christian freedom.
As well as American norms.
Yeah, so if your religion is great, prove it, on its own merits, without needing the force of the government or law to do that for you. But and Thomas Jefferson said something similar. This is not an exact quote. No, Benjamin Franklin said, if the religion is good, it'll support itself. But if the religion needs the support of tax dollars and the government in order to do its mission, that's a sign that it's not a good religion. Because what? Their God is so cheap that he can't run. Their God is so powerless that he needs tax dollars to do his work. He can't do it on his own. I could find the exact quote, but you can look it up.
Yeah. You were talking about you think America should be a liberal enterprise. Does America need a healthy Republican Party?
Well, America needs a healthy debate, I think. And there are conservatives in this country. They have their views, and they should not be shut out. So, yeah. It is weird what's happened to it with Trump, though. I mean, what's going to happen? You should have another podcast about post-Trump in the Republican Party. What's going to happen to that party? Because they're not all stupid. A lot of them are caring people. They have conservative values.
Sure.
And there are people who have liberal social views and conservative economic fiscal views, in which, can coexist. There are some strong conservatives who are pro-abortion and pro-gay rights and all that, but when it comes to economics, they're conservative. So in the Republican Party, there used to be room for all of that. But so what is it? What's wrong with our species that we fall for a big man? It's probably evolutionary.
It is, because it's important to be a part of a group, number one. Many people say that religion teaches you to be subservient to a leader, and that primes people for authoritarianism. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think it's hardwired into our species. I'm working on my next book called The End of Worship, and part 2 is going to present what I think is a viable but probably controversial hypothesis that to some degree worship of authority has been kind of domesticated, hardwired into us since the beginning of cities, which was only 6,000 years ago, that's all.
Yep.
Agriculture was before then, and there were local leaders all around. But before cities, there was no concept of a king of kings. There were no kings. There were no emperors. And there wasn't that strict hierarchy within our civilization where you had these big men at the top. And maybe some of that comes from our primate connection, because there's alpha males in the primate species. So there's had to be something for evolution to work on. But I think kings and military leaders and slave owners, and to some degree husbands even, have controlled breeding to some degree. And the rebels, what happens to rebels? They get they don't breed as much. They get knocked off, right?
Mm-hmm.
The subservient sheep. And it's like when you're breeding sheep or dogs or something, you only keep the docile ones and you kill off and eat the other ones. So to a much lesser degree, I think, something like that has been happening in our species, and we don't know it. If you're a dog and you're born and you're in this house and you have this master, you don't know that your species was carefully domesticated to be that subservient dog.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know. You just hear. And I think we don't know in our species that to some degree we have been, bred and the kings with their harems and who had access to breeding and all of that kind of stuff. And I don't know if this hypothesis has any merit, but I do think that to some degree we are instinctively worshipful creatures to some big man, some master, some lord. Like when a dog looks at its master, how adoring it is, that kind of thing. Not all dogs are like that, by the way.
Yeah.
Some were bred to be guard dogs and attack dogs and but the ones that were bred to be our companions.
Right.
So that's not going to go away unless you have some counter breeding. I don't know. That's not going to go away. I think there's been a shift in our species. There will still be rebels. There will always be, the people who don't. But I think there's been a shift in our species more towards subservience and obedience. And look how we revere the monarchy, right? Even though it's a silly thing.
Yeah.
Or look how we revere celebrities or heroes, like there's some kind of demigods or something. And if you were in their presence, you would feel trembling like, oh, that's just another person. But there's something in our brains that's...
Yeah.
And so when some strongman leader steps forth in any country, a lot of people go, yeah, good, we need that, And I think it's not conscious. I think it's just part of who we have been bred to become.
And that's actually what you're talking about, a couple different things, but evolutionary psychology is deep into what you're doing there. But the other thing, I've always wanted to do a documentary called The Biology of Your Politics, because obviously people are born more liberal, more conservative, and they have tests. They can test you on all that stuff. So there are people that have high authoritarian leanings, and other folks like myself or you are like, we're totally fine with a little bit of a chaos. We're not that, we don't need everything to be buttoned down, controlled. So there's a lot to what you're saying.
There has to be some genetic component, but of course, everything's genetic. It's kind of trivial to say that. Everything about us is genetic, but there has to be something. Why would there be a trait or a feature in our species? What would explain the prevalence of it? And of course, like any other trait, it's going to vary.
Yeah.
There's going to be the people on both sides of the curve that are, and the ones that are over here, the rebels, I think, tend to get either killed young or they are not allowed to breed as well. And the ones who are subservient, they breed a lot, and so you're going to get that kind of a shift in our species. But I have a lot more reading to do before I totally flesh out this part 2 of that book.
But there is I see exactly what you're saying, but there is a split, between, liberals and conservatives on that, because liberals are totally okay. They don't necessarily want anyone to tell them what to do. More independent, where conservatives, if you run some of those tests, it's like they want to be told what to do. And if you have these conservatives that are very much in the conservative religion, that patriarchy, that hierarchy is very, very important.
Yeah, they need it. Yeah, they need it because they don't trust their own thoughts, and they've been preached at. I used to preach it. That you can't trust your own reasoning. You're a worm. You're depraved. You're deserving of hell, and you only need the grace of Jesus to His sacrifice for us. And if you look at the postures of prayer, when I'm in the airport, you see those prayer chapel things. Mm-hmm. It's a person like this on their knees with their heads down and their hands like this.
Submission.
All of the postures of prayer are identical to the postures of slavery. Your wrists are shackled, so I'm no threat to the master.
That's right.
You are big and great, but I'm nothing to you, Lord. And I'm kneeling down and I make myself little so that you can be great. And a lot of those hymns, how great thou art, and a lot of Bible verses, that really a lot of people actually view themselves that way. It's a negative view of human nature.
Yes, it is.
It's a put down of human nature, which is a glad, happy put down. They want to do that. They want to be nothing so that the Lord can be great.
Well, what you're talking about, you see in the primates. That what you're describing is submission displays.
Yeah.
And because that's what we learn from our relatives in the apes and other primates, I should say. That's a learned trait.
That's true. And Robert Sapolsky, he's done a lot of study like with baboons. He lived in Africa for a long time. And he's a good friend, and we've talked with him a lot. Each of the beta males are subservient to the alpha, but each one of them wants to be an alpha.
Yes, that's true.
In that primate species, each one of them wants to have access to the females. They want to be the top one. But in the meantime, they're not, so they've got to be. And what Sapolsky did was an experiment where he would dart them, like with chemical, drugs, and with testosterone. He would test their testosterone, and that's quite a story, by the way. How do you get close enough to a wild baboon to not get killed by it and still dart it? But he discovered that the trouble is not testosterone. Some of these beta males had very high levels of testosterone, but they were submissive and compliant to the alpha. But to the gamma delta males, they were vicious. Mm-hmm. Anybody below them, they were vicious with. So there are human males who have very high levels of testosterone, but we live in a society where it doesn't express.
Right. As much, yeah.
Yeah, and some males are surprised because they're peaceful, they're gentle, and so testosterone's not the problem. It's testosterone mixed with this hierarchical structure that is happening, and so you have this alpha big man leader up there. Then that triggers a lot of our instinctive, violent tendencies or whatever it is that we have.
Let me shift gears here for a second. According to the Pew Research Center, in the United States, 40% of liberals are atheists. Among those liberals who identify as atheists, 89% of them identify as Democrats, 8% are unidentified, and only 3% identify as Republicans. So when I read that, I think, so atheists and liberal Christians are bonding together at the ballot box to fight against conservative religion and conservative politics. What do you think about that?
Yeah, especially here in this town.
And we're in Madison, Wisconsin.
Yeah, here in Madison, Wisconsin, it's at least 50% non-religious, which is pretty high in this county, this Dane County. And Annie Laurie and I, we have religious friends and neighbors, and we find ourselves marching in the same parades. You know what I mean? It's like it's the issues that matter. It's not the religious division that matters. And we care about this world. And so there's a lot of good Christians who might believe in another world, but like Ingersoll said, one world at a time, right? So a lot of good Christians who realize that while we're on this earth, before we go to heaven or whatever, let's still care about humanity. Let's really love people. And those are basically the same humanistic principles that most atheists would adopt if they were adopt a philosophy at all, a moral philosophy. So yeah, we do march together. We care about it. And the truly good Christians, they don't care because they're results oriented. They want politics to work to help people, and whoever they work with to do that with, it's that's America.
It's funny that you say they want politics to work, because I have this theory that Democrats believe in government working, or liberals, and conservative Republicans, they don't like the government. They want smaller government, less regulation for various reasons. So it creates an issue where, Republicans don't want anything to work. They're less likely to approve legislation that Democrats bring up that, hey, we're going to fix this problem, like immigration. And it's like, man, that's a really great issue for us campaigning, we're not going to solve that problem.
Yeah, so why are they in government, if they don't like government? But
that is the weird thing. It's like if you don't like government, you don't think it works, why are you running for office?
Yeah. And we can't paint them all with the same brush.
No,
obviously.
I'm obviously generalizing.
But in general, I think you have a point there. And they want less government intrusion into our lives, unless it comes to abortion or gay, then
trans.
They want, then of course they do want government to control, but because it's a moral thing to them. They think the government should police morality, and then if you're anti-regulation, I would say, and I think many Christians and many atheists would say that that's harmful. That's causing harm. If you're dumping chemicals into a river, that's actually harming people and harming the environment.
Yeah.
So shouldn't we do things to minimize harm? And so many of the regulations, maybe there's a case for too much regulation, but many of them are aimed at reducing harm, making things more fair. And of course, those regulations are affecting the pocketbook of the business owners. They don't like them.
Yep.
They want to make more money. But hey, this is the society we live in. We're not just all. Maybe conservatives tend to be more selfish-minded. They care about. What they're embracing is themselves, and more liberals tend to be more embracing outwardly. Like, let's embrace everybody. Let's not just embrace me and mine, and I got mine, and you too bad,
Mm-hmm.
But let's be fair and loving toward everybody else. And I think you're right. We do have some Republicans in our group, but it's a small percentage. And I think they're good people. I don't know what their policies are and everything, but in general, in our group, they tend to be more liberal, democratic, progressive types. Maybe because freedom of thought comes with freedom. The word liberal means free, basically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Freedom. And by the way, the word liberal is in the Bible, and the word conservative is not.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
It's not used in the same way, but still, the word liberal is in many English translations.
What about the historical confusion over that the United States was founded on Christian values?
There's no confusion. It's just people pretending otherwise. There's no confusion there. If America was founded on Christian values, then why doesn't it say so somewhere? The word Christian doesn't appear anywhere. Even in the Declaration, which doesn't govern our country, by the way. The Declaration was an act of severance. It was a rebellious act. We are a rebellious nation, right? We kicked out the king, the Lord, the master, the sovereign. We wanted to think for ourselves. But even in the Declaration, there's no Christianity or Jesus.
Right.
And the words that Jefferson primarily chose when he was drafting that were the same kind of words that deists were using. And Jefferson and the people who were seceding from Britain knew that the head of England was also the head of the church.
Yep.
So they're framing this in this language. And so they didn't say Jesus or Christianity or the Church of England or any of that. They just said nature's God. And nature's God was kind of Spinoza's, not really a personal being, but more of a, before Darwin, they didn't really have a concept of, pre-Enlightenment, the pre-Darwinian thinkers were still struggling with that. And so some of them thought, like Thomas Paine thought, there must be some deistic creator, but he doesn't write books, doesn't do miracles, doesn't talk, doesn't do any of that. Mm-hmm. The book that this God writes is the forest and the trees. And even Thomas Paine said that. Look around. He wasn't an atheist.
Right.
Although Teddy Roosevelt called him a dirty little atheist, wrongly. So when they wrote that declaration, it was not a pro-Christian document. But Christians today read that and go, oh, our Creator, see? But that wasn't our founding document.
Right.
As an important document, obviously, but
It
wasn't our founding document is the Constitution. That's what runs us. There's no God in there. There's no Jesus. There's no Christianity. And the only religion you find in it is to exclusionary.
Yeah. Separation.
Yeah. No religious test for public office, which was important. And in fact, we know how important it was. It wasn't just accidental. There were people at the convention who wanted God and Jesus in the Constitution. They thought they should have it, but they voted it down. They grappled with it, they thought about it, and yet they said no. The matters of religion belong to the private matter of conscience and heart, and the government's not going to get involved in that. Everybody can think what they want and believe and even fight with each other, but they wrote a godless document, totally godless. And some of them try to reach and say, well, yeah, it says year of our Lord at the end, right? The year of... Well, that was tacked on after by somebody else. They never voted on that, first of all.
Right.
And that was just a dating convention that somebody said, well, we're going to sign it that way.
It's semantics at that point, I
Yeah,
guess.
it's a conventional thing. And besides that, that's not even saying Jesus or any of that, or Christianity. So our country was fortunately not founded as a Christian nation. It's true that some of the founders wanted it to be, and some of them were devout Christians. It's true they were. And Washington sometimes went to church, but he never took communion. He was not really that devout about it, They were pretty much worldly thinkers. So in order to correct what those Christian nationalists think is a wrong, they want to point to, well, let's put God on our money, or let's put God in the pledge. That was deliberately put in with a deliberate religious
motivation. Yeah.
And the Pledge of Allegiance, when I went to kindergarten in 1954, I learned the Pledge of Allegiance the original way. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mm-hmm. That's the way it was forever. I mean, since, what's his name? What's the guy's name? Bingham? He was a socialist who wrote the thing. But then Congress changed it, and then when I went to first grade, I had to relearn it. And it sounds weird. When you learn it the one way when you're young, that sounds like the right way. One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So here God is dividing what was indivisible. Because the word indivisible meant the 13 colonies. All the colonies are one now. We're indivisible, and we're all united. But putting God in there breaks that, and it only refers to those who believe in a God. So that phrase shouldn't be there, but it is. And about the same time, they put "In God We Trust" on the coins, on the currency. I mean, it had been on a few coins before then. So that was a deliberate effect, especially coming out of Billy Graham and all of those evangelicals, to try to correct our country, because they saw that it was godless, and so they're trying to correct it.
Yes. Let's talk about your book, Contraduction, and how you came up with the word, and explain that to folks, what that word actually means.
Contraduction. Some people think it's a typo, because on the keyboard, the I and the U are right next. Contradiction, contraduction. So, it's a new word to philosophy, and many philosophers are using it. And now, since I came up with the word, Steven Pinker said it's an ingenious concept. He put a blurb on it, and the great British philosopher A.C. Grayling, who's very popular in Europe, he read it in one afternoon. He says, "Yes, now we have a word for something, right?" So,
congrats on that. Yes.
So, contraduction is a 180-degree reversal of reality. When you look at it from a human point of view, you think things are this way when it's actually totally reversed. And one example is the sunrise.
Right.
We call it sunrise, but the sun's not rising. From our point of view, we think the sun's rising, but it's actually we who are rising. So that's the contradiction. Or a simple explanation is, like, you ever been sitting on a train that's not moving, and the train next to you starts to move, and you briefly think it's you that's moving? That happens to all of us, or a car or whatever, an airplane. From our point of view, we see reality one way, but it's actually totally reversed of what it was. And you were mentioning, toward the end of the book, I bring up race. And I picked up the book at the airport. I was going to Virginia to give a talk about this concept. And I had already sent the manuscript to the publisher, but I picked up the book, Who's Black and Why? Is that the name of it? Who's Black and Why? In other words, what is race? And it talks about how in the 18th century, these European philosophers and scientists were struggling with why are black people black? What's wrong? What went wrong? And so they had these societies and they had these papers and they had these studies about trying to understand what was wrong, and so are they closer to the sun down there and they get burnt, or what? Is it something in, I don't know. What? And they were all coming up with theories. They didn't know.
Right.
And before that time, there really was not a concept of race as we think of it today. There wasn't. And they were sort of the first to come up with this idea, especially in France. And in fact, the word Ethiopia is from the Greek, which means burnt face. And they've even kept that phrase. The word Nigeria, I was just in Nigeria recently, and that's from the word for black, right? It's like calling it was a colonial word to describe, what's wrong with those people? And the contradiction here is that they got it completely backwards. Actually, the dark skin and the dark eyes, black eyes, are the normal full pigmentation in our genome. And when humans moved to the north where there was less sunlight and less vitamin D, a mutation in our genome allowed for the skin to turn white and the eyes correspondingly turn lighter in most of them, which allowed more vitamin D. And so the question is not why are they black? The question is reversed. Why are they white, right? Why are they the mutation? What happened? And now we can understand it. But back then, they had no concept. They would never have understood that our species came out of Africa.
Right.
And then when Cro-Magnon came up and then lived up in the, they never would have been a concept in their mind. They had it from their point of view, from the white point of view. They
were the norm.
They're the norm, and everything else had to be explained from their point of view when it was totally reversed. So that's one example of a contraduction and in the book I give a number of other examples of, then
that's my favorite one. I just think that really illustrates your new
what
work.
Happens.
Yeah.
But the book basically started with religion, really. The fine-tuning argument was really the motivation. I did a debate where my opponent used the word abductive. We've heard of deductive logic and inductive logic, but he said, I'm going to be arguing with abductive logic. And I knew what that meant, and I know it sounds like a big fancy word. It just means your best guess, basically. Abductive is a weak kind of, it doesn't really give you a strong conclusion, but it gets you a best guess on the table. It's kind of like investigators finding a prime suspect. You still got a lot of work to do.
Right. That's your best guess.
You still got to convict him and you charge him and convict him.
Got to get some evidence.
Yeah. So I was thinking abductive, and his arguments I thought were reversed, and I thought his arguments about fine-tuning and about evidence and all of that were backward. And right in the middle of the debate, in my opening statement, I was thinking on my feet, and I said, I think we need a new word besides abductive. And I ad-libbed. I said, maybe postductive. And it turns out that's the wrong word. I mean, I needed a prefix that didn't mean after, but reverse. So contraductive means you've reversed it 180 degrees. And so, in fact, that debate that I did in March of 2022 is being made into a book published by Erdman's publisher. And if you know Erdman's, they're a big Christian publisher. They're publishing the debate. Both of our opening statements and rebuttals are in it. Then they have enlisted some atheist scholars, atheist philosophers, and some theistic to comment on our debate as well. So the book will be out. You'll be able to read it, and then our rebuttals and comments back and forth to each other. And in the book, I say, if you read this debate, I use the word postductive. Well, I've changed my mind since then. Now there's a new book called Contraduction.
That's awesome. Why in America is it important that we have Freedom from Religion Foundation that you work with? Why is that important?
Well, for two reasons. There are a lot of Americans in this democracy who are personally free from religion. Atheists, agnostics, whatever we call ourselves.
Long list, yeah.
I think most, well, at least secular humanists would call themselves, non-believers. And it's a matter of focus. What are they thinking about? And so there's a lot of people who are free from religion, a lot of non-religious. And so our organization exists to promote the views of the non-theists because we're here too. We're a part of the society, and we're growing, actually. But the second, and I think more important reason, is that we think government should be free from religion. Not just, you know, I mean, you and I, you know, we as non-believers, we can't, I don't know what your views are, but we can't
I'm an atheist,
just,
so.
Okay, good. We can't just go around and force everybody to think like us, right?
Of course not.
We wouldn't want to.
No.
I mean,
It's not necessary.
I mean, we might like to think it would be a better society with more atheists, but we're not going to forcefully do that. And we don't think the government should forcefully do that. I mean, how ludicrous if the government were to become atheistic and force everybody to be atheist. I mean, that's a betrayal of freedom. Freedom and justice and liberty for all means we all can believe or not. So we advocate and work toward and take legal action toward a secular government, making sure that religion and government stay separate. And there's even a lot of believers who agree with us, and sometimes they join our lawsuits. They agree that if you mix religion and government, they both get dirty. They should be separate, and in fact, our founders thought that. And when Jefferson wrote his famous Danbury Baptist letter to the Baptists in Connecticut on January the 1st, 1802, he went to work on January the 1st. He pointed out that he used that phrase, wall of separation between church and state, which protects religious freedom.
Yes.
Because soon as some religion gets in charge, whose religion? Whose is it going to be, right?
Yep.
Would the evangelicals like it if Muslims took over the government and said, now we all have to pray to the east how many times a day? They wouldn't like that. They'd scream. They would want state-church separation.
Yeah.
They would want to separate it out. But people who have political power and people who think they are in the privileged majority of Christians think, well, this is our country, and we will tolerate those of you who are not Christians. But if we're in control, well, it depends who they are. Some of them think that they would want to force everybody. So we take legal action. We write letters of complaint around the country. And it's not like we're roaming the country trying to cause problems. These complaints come to us from people, somebody in
who need your help.
Yeah. Somebody who's a non-religious family in a school and the teacher's praying with the kids, they may not want to identify themselves in that community as the complainant.
Right.
They can contact us and say, you know what's going on in my school? So our attorneys can write a letter, and sometimes, not enough, I don't know what the percentage is, 20 or 30% of the time, when they get our letter and we inform them you're breaking the law, and the Supreme Court has ruled on this, and here's the precedent, they will change it. They'll stop it.
Right.
And sometimes they'll stop it because they agree in principle. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they stop it because they don't want to be sued and waste, scarce resources fighting a losing lawsuit, which is fine with us, whatever the reasoning is. And sometimes when the principal stops the violation, one principal took down the Jesus painting from the high school wall saying, I'm only doing this because the court ordered me to, and really because their insurance company told them, we're not going to defend you on this. We're not going to pay for this one. So and so that principal is able to save face.
Yeah, it gives them cover.
Yeah, principal is able to say, I wanted Jesus on the wall, but we've got to take it down, right? So so our letters are effective, and every week at the legal meetings, Maddie or somebody will report, we had 7 victories this week, or 13. Last week there were 13 victories from the letters, which means we didn't have to go to court.
Right.
Because going to court is time-consuming and expensive, but then we do go to court. We also have litigating attorneys, and we will take lawsuits. We're part of a group that's suing Louisiana over the 10 Commandments, and we're involved in Oklahoma over Walters putting the Bibles in the schools. And we've had, I don't know, more than 100 actual lawsuits. And we win most of them, and when we lose, very often we lose on standing, not on merits, if you know what that means.
Yeah. Yep.
The court didn't say we were wrong. The court just said you can't
don't have
sue.
standing, yeah. Someone didn't get hurt or injured from this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and that happened in our case when we sued over George Bush and the faith-based initiative. We got a victory in the lower courts, and the appeals court agreed with us. It was wrong to do that, But the Supreme Court, it's called the Hine decision.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court overturned our victory, not saying we were wrong.
Just you didn't have
Just
standing.
that, because Congress didn't specifically allocate the funding for that specific purpose, you as a taxpayer didn't have the necessary nexus of connection. All this legalese stuff.
Yeah.
So they threw the case out. The lower courts thought we did, right? But
Yeah.
the Supreme Court found a way to duck the issue, and we had won some we had won some of those faith-based lawsuits before in Milwaukee. We won, and then we won one in Arizona. But the Supreme Court basically raised the bar to standing, which is unfortunate. Now it's tougher for us to get into court on some of these issues because of that decision, which means we have to be much more careful in picking who's the plaintiff, what's the injury, and all that. But we're proceeding ahead, and we're having good success. A big one earlier this year was finally wrapping up our lawsuit against the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, who had censored our display at the Capitol while allowing the nativity scene. And he lost and lost and lost on appeal and lost, and they tried to reconfigure. And finally, we got the final check from the state of Texas, the final for legal fees, and we won that case. So that was pretty delicious. It took 8 years. 8 years for that whole thing to go through the works. And since then, they've changed their policy, and so they're not allowing any displays there. But if they ever do, we'll be right back to ask for ours to come back in again.
Well, last question. What do you think the motivation is for, like, Governor Abbott or any group that is putting religion in where they know it's not supposed to be? They're going to lose the case anyway. Is it what is their motivation?
I think with some of them, it's sincere. They have these religious views. They think it's good for the country. They think liberal or atheistic views are bad for the country for morals. And so they're doing their best, sincerely according to their Christian principles, to try to make the country better. But I think in many other cases it's cynical. I'm cynical about it. I don't think Trump really believes in moral values or Christian values, or any of that stuff, right? And in many cases it's just political.
Yeah.
It's pandering to the voters.
That's what I think it is.
Yeah. I mean, somebody like Abbott, I think, is a sincere believer. But he knows that the voters they're churchgoers, and they're going to like him doing these things. And sometimes these are gotcha issues. Sometimes these legislation is proposed knowing it's not going to pass, but then they can use it in their next election to say, hey, I voted for the Ten Commandments, and even though it was unconstitutional, they know the voters are going to like that. So there's no single motivation there, but and I'm not going to say they're all insincere,
Right.
because I was a sincere believer.
Sure,
I wasn't
of course.
faking it. I wasn't, pretending. But I don't know.
Yeah, it just seems like it's a wedge issue. It's divisive.
Yeah.
It's like states. I don't know if this has kind of gone by the side, but at least in Kansas and some other states where they'll put on that English is the official language of the state,
Yeah.
just to be xenophobic. Yeah, it's
Just to get somebody to, and
red meat for the base.
The U.S. doesn't have an official language.
Right.
Most of us speak English, but a lot of people don't. And it's, and it's a free country, right? A lot of people think it is official, that we must, but because
I thought American was the official language.
Well, okay, that's right, American. but you got to be careful, because way back in colonial times, the word American meant the Indians.
The native, yeah.
Yeah, the Americans were that.
Right.
They were the Americans, and the colonizers were, what were they?
British or whatever.
European.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Dan, thank you very much for taking the time to join me today for the podcast. I love talking to you, so thank you.
Well, this is fun. Let us know when it airs, and
We'll do.
We can promote it.
We'll definitely do that. Thanks, Dan.
All right, that's a wrap on episode 3 of America After Trump, America's Second Reconstruction. Be sure to check out Dan's books, especially his new book, Contraduction. I really enjoyed reading it. Until next week, thank you, take care, and have a great week.